You are listening to Book and Spade.
I'm not sure how many of you have read or watched The Lord of the Rings. It is a series of books and films that have deeply shaped my own childhood, and I'm sure that if you've spent more than 5 minutes with me, you will have learned their influence on my own perception of my faith. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien wrote The Hobbit as a children's story for his own kids, teaching as a professor of Anglo-Saxon in Oxford during the 1930s, and was pressed upon to write a sequel. But his sequel was no children's story. His gigantic book was cut artificially into 3 by his publisher, and he would not have finished it had it not been for the persuasions of his good friend C.S. Lewis, who he had personally led to belief in Jesus Christ. And yet, if we look at the realms of the Lord of the Rings, a world of wizards and dragons and elves and halflings called hobbits, what we find are commentaries on faith in the face of spiritual darkness, truth in the face of cleverly devised falsehoods, themes of temptation, which all derive from the Christian West and from the Catholic Universal Christian tradition, stretching back even to ancient Israel. And therefore, it should be little wonder that Tolkien might have subconsciously infused into his narrative some of his concerns, not just about human nature generally, but his concerns about the church generally too. Tolkien did intend to write a sequel to The Lord of the Rings. I believe it was called The New Shadow or The Return of the Shadow. I've previously recorded about this, in which the successors of Aragorn, the righteous king, the holy king, the good king, who is a figure of Christ, where his successors in the realm which he established called Gondor become as corrupt and as wicked as those who have gone on before. And there is the rise of the worship of the villain of the series, Sauron, and of orcs, his ghoulish, demonic-like hordes, even after they have been removed from the face of the earth. So much so that there is a cult of children and political leaders as well who end up even worshiping the shadow. And it has to be infiltrated before it can lead to the corruption of the entire kingdom. J.R.R. Tolkien decided not to write that work, not to write that book, because he believed it was too depressing. And I believe in reality he felt it was quite too real. Tolkien was writing in the 50s, and perhaps the early 60s at that point. And if we look at how tame the world of that era was, compared to the media, compared to the music, compared to some of the literal pentagrams that we see on our television screens and little screens today, it makes us really wonder how prophetic John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was. But if we take a step back, I think that we can find this even in the pages of The Return of the King. And I think Tolkien may have, once again, subconsciously, I'm not saying he intentionally did this, went so far as to even encode a future meditation on the role of the papacy. So there is a theme in The Lord of the Rings that there was a great line of kings one time that fought off evil. And the line of kings disappeared. And they left behind a kingdom. And that kingdom was ruled over by a steward. A very familiar concept in the ancient world. The steward is essentially the manager while the boss is away. And the steward has a little throne beside the big empty chair of the king while the king is away at war. And while this king or line of kings disappeared, the stewards ruled in the king's name. while he was absent. And the last of these stewards is a figure by the name of Denethor. And Denethor ends up falling into possession in The Lord of the Rings of a great tool of magic called a palantir, which allows you to see what's going around the world. It would allow you to see what was going on in different countries. And Denethor sees that a vast enemy army is coming his way. Ships with black sails, a sign of the enemy. And his castle is surrounded. And therefore Denethor assumes he might as well literally end his life and literally lead his court into ruin and destroy the line of stewards, because he is utterly convinced that the end has come. And he also says he will not stubbornly, that he will not bow down to the returning king, the king who is on his way back home, because surely that would be to bow down to a peasant, a nobody, basically. The irony about Denethor's despair is that on those ships with black sails that he is seeing at a distance are not enemies, but instead is the king returning to his people, disguised with an army of those who are coming to rescue. And what is remarkable is while he visually sees correctly, visually one side of the coin, as it were, that there are these problems in the world, these points of despair in the world, he doesn't see that there are also good things that are being concealed from him that are happening at the same time too, which his technology, which is work of magic, that palantir, will not show him, because it is controlled by the Lord of Darkness himself, by the Satan of that world, by Sauron. We live in a time where we are covered in palantiri by this kind of technology. This iPhone alone can log into visions of whole distant lands, and we're surrounded by the media, by the news. But we don't see the whole story, we see a partial story. And often that partial story leads to despair. Whereas faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. Denethor was the rightful steward of the kingdom. He had the keys, dare I say, to the kingdom. He sat on the throne, the chair, beside the throne of the king in the king's absence, speaking in his voice and his authority. But Denethor had lost his faith. Denethor had lost his faith. And as a result, although he had the right authority, he abused that authority, so much so that he became almost an anti-steward. In the Roman Catholic tradition, you would call him an anti-pope. Although technically that would even be inaccurate, because an anti-pope is a figure who is a non-pope. And there are arguments today within Roman Catholicism, in light of certain developments going on, whether you can have a valid pope who is one, who is a successor of Peter, a steward of the kingdom, as it were. A valid pope who, at the same time, has views that are not in keeping with the faith universal. That's a question that is going on right now. And I'm not saying that that is or is not the case, but that is a discussion. Why is that interesting, right? Because it is asked by many, well, surely we are talking about a world nowadays where if only the leaders, if only the shepherds, if only the stewards, Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, would just stand up and be the true heroes that they are called to be, and live up to their office as shepherds, then certainly there would be a revolution in the world and the world would be Christianized. But in The Lord of the Rings, right, it is a hobbit and it is a prophetic character, a wizard by the name of Gandalf, who interrupts when the leaders themselves are about to do horrendous things, evil things, because they believe that the battle is lost. And they're willing to throw down their arms and surrender. I would argue, fundamentally, that what is being suggested by J.R.R. Tolkien is that it is the normal men and women in the pews. It is the normal men and women who are called to stand up, speak truth to power, be prophets, in other words, and at times, even like Paul in Galatians, who rebuked Peter to his face when he had erred, lovingly prevent the fathers and the mothers from burning down the house. J.R.R. Tolkien may have prophesied the state of the church and of the government and of many institutions in that act. Now, does that mean that there are no more stewards anymore after the return of the king, after the return of Aragorn? Certainly not. In the book, The Lord of the Rings, Denethor has a son who survives, is rescued, and the line of stewards continues. There is, dare I say, a reformation that occurs. I would argue that we are all called to, therefore, reform the institutions in which we exist, not by denying the validity or authority of those who have laid the foundations gone before, but rather instead to critique the misapplication of their offices. And I would argue that J.R.R. Tolkien, therefore, although he did claim actually in one private letter to be an anarchist, would not be in favor of overthrowing a monarchy or a existing executive branch of government, etc. But instead is more interested in returning to the state of who Aragorn is, the returning king in the books. Well, on one hand is the royal heir of all the kingdoms of Middle-earth, but walks humbly as a mere ranger and still views himself, even after the coronation, as a humble man. In some sense, you have your feet in the earth, but you have your head rooted in heaven. And that's an image which we have lost in our ideal of leadership, spiritual and carnal. And I think it transcends denomination. I think it transcends politics. I think we have created an idolatrous understanding of who our earthly leaders are supposed to be, rather than asking ourselves, what can I do? What can I do to make of my home, my community, my neighborhood a hallowed environment, so that the true king can return, who is, and my understanding as a Christian, Jesus Christ. Because after all, we also are stewards, aren't we? Every Christian. And we have to ask ourselves, will we become duped by the Palantirs, by the technology that we are employing as well?